Support for this program is provided by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Through sustainable forestry, LFA members promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forests for generations to come. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney.
And I'm Robert Travis Scott, President of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. Well, on April 13th, with a drop of a gavel, the state legislature ended its 3-week special session to redraw Louisiana's political boundaries. Just 11 days later, legislators convened for this year's regular session. While lawmakers will have until June 23rd to complete this session, the task they face is no less daunting than the special one: how to balance the state's budget with a $1.6 billion revenue shortfall.
Well, for the third year in a row, Louisiana must make cuts to its operating budget. Federal stimulus dollars helped to fill the gap the last 2 years, but this money has disappeared. The state's budget must be balanced, unlike the federal budget. So how does the governor propose reconciling the state's budget for the upcoming fiscal year? And will the legislature approve of his plans that include some controversial proposals? This evening, we explore where the lines of a different sort will be drawn this session in the battle over the 2011 budget. To many, this fiscal year was to be the cliff year, when the state's budget was left dangling as federal stimulus dollars ran out. But Barry Erwin, president of a Council for Better Louisiana, says the drop may not be as severe as expected.
If you look at the governor's budget, the worst case scenario was we had a $1.6 billion shortfall and perhaps conceivably $1.6 billion in cuts to make in state general funds. That's not really what you see in the budget. You do see significant budget cuts, but you see another kind of hodgepodge of different revenue measures and scenarios put together that mitigate that to a large degree.
To bridge the gap from the loss of stimulus money, the governor's proposed $24.9 billion budget makes use of $417 million in one-time revenues to cover recurring expenses.
The number or the amount of one-time dollars that are being used this year is much less than it's been the last couple of years. We're talking about $400+ million compared to like well over $1 billion last year. So we've been using a lot of one-time revenue in the past. We've cut that down significantly, but we're still using a pretty good chunk of it. And some of that is contingent on some things.
One of the bigger contingencies in the governor's budget is the sale of 3 state prisons to generate roughly $85 million. The governor proposes selling correctional facilities in Wynne, Allen, and Avoyelles parishes. The Dabadie Correctional Center in Pineville would be privatized.
All 4 facilities that are in question right now, they're very close to me.
Chris Hazel is a Republican representative from Rapides Parish, whose district includes Pineville. Hazel has public safety concerns about putting the control of inmates into the hands of a private firm.
We know what we're getting with the state. The state provides very, very valued security officers that are trained. They've been doing this. This is a career for them.
Hazel also questions the logic of selling the Wynne and Allen prisons, which are currently being run by a private management company.
I'm trying to understand the common sense of having something that you're paid for and you're going to sell it and then you're going to have a lease engaged and you still have to pay them the per diem rate. So if it's such a great deal, why don't we just leave those 2 privatized as they are?
The funds generated from the prison sales would be directed to the Department of Health and Hospitals, or DHH. Through the use of one-time funds such as these, DHH has cut just 1.7% in Jindal's budget.
Kicking the can down the road is not the fiscal policy that we've been learned to expect.
David Hood is the senior healthcare analyst with the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. Hood says while the use of one-time funds protects DHH from large cuts this year,
it postpones the day of reckoning, when we have to actually balance that budget with recurring revenue or with budget cuts, one or the other, or both.
The governor's budget relies on his proposed Coordinated Care Networks plan to create savings of $24 million. The revamped Medicaid delivery system is a move toward privatization that Hood says is coupled with decreasing the number of DHH employees, a loss of 3,000 positions over the last 2 years.
You know, we're taking an axe to the workforce, and there might be consequences later on. We'll just have to wait and see.
Lee Griffin, a commissioner with the State Civil Service Department, says that with a $1.6 billion deficit, state employees unfortunately become a big target.
Probably 70–80% of our expenses are salaries and benefits. So if you're going to attack a budget hole that big, you need to address your compensation issues.
In addition to the loss of over 4,000 state employee positions this year, for the second year in a row, state workers won't be receiving merit pay increases.
We don't like freezing salaries. We know that employees are facing increased gasoline prices and food prices, and they've got financial obligations, but where do you go? I mean, you have to go to a lot of places to find $1.6 billion.
The governor also proposes a 3% increase in the amount that state employees pay towards their retirement plan, saving the state $24 million. The Louisiana State Employees Retirement System says the proposal raises constitutional issues.
I think we ought to start with looking at some of the tax exemptions that we give to businesses across the state.
Lydia Jackson is a Democrat and vice chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Jackson says that instead of focusing on contingencies, cuts could be made to the 441 tax exemptions that the state offers. The Louisiana Budget Project estimates that tax breaks cost the state over $7 billion annually, nearly as much as the $7.7 billion in state revenue expected this year.
Some of them are great. They're effective tools for economic development. But when you're giving away as much out of the back door as you're taking into the front door, I think it's time for the legislature to take a serious examination at that exemption budget.
On the revenue side of the equation, a proposal to increase the sales tax on cigarettes is receiving support from Democrat Representative and Legislative Black Caucus member Herbert Dixon.
All of the money tied to any tax that's successful, it would be tied to the health program for the state of Louisiana.
Dixon says despite pleas from anti-tax constituents in his Alexandria district, he sees the move as necessary to save central Louisiana health care facilities.
We're going to have to think out of the box. We're going to have to do some things that might not be in our comfort zone, and certainly this is one of those areas.
While the governor says he will veto any tax proposals, a recent statewide survey by the LSU Public Policy Research Lab shows that 73% of Louisiana citizens would support such a tax to help balance the budget. No matter how lawmakers determine to close the budget gap this regular session, Erwin anticipates quite a show.
Any of those pieces that the legislature does not go along with create gaps and holes in the budget that the governor has produced so far, and then that will require some more wrangling and trying to figure out who do you cut now, or do you cut this person here, do you fill that gap in this way, whatever. It's just going to create, a lot of excitement among legislators and the public as we go through this process.
Well, joining me in our studio audience are some of those excited members of the public. They include Baton Rouge area residents who were randomly recruited and surveyed for us by LSU's Public Policy Research Lab. Also joining us is a high school student from Opelousas representing the Legislative Youth Advisory Council, as well as a member of Louisiana Progress, a statewide political action organization. Now, reviewing some of the survey questions. When asked their confidence level in state government to address the state's budget shortfall, a total of 57% of those responding say they are not very or not at all confident. A total of 41% feel very or somewhat confident. Asked their opinion on using one-time revenue to bridge the budget gap, 55% of respondents say to avoid that approach even if it solves the current shortfall. 37% of those surveyed would support the use of one-time revenue opportunities, even if they don't solve long-term budget issues. As a source of additional revenue, a large majority of those responding, 70%, support the repeal of existing state laws that protect certain areas of state government spending from budget cuts. 12% oppose this move and 18% are unsure. And when given the choice of whether the state should raise taxes, cut spending, or a combination of both to handle the budget shortfall, 7% support raising taxes, 28% favor cutting spending, while the majority, 60%, prefer a combination of both. So let's start there. How do we figure out how to close this budget gap? And let's look first of all at the whole issue of priorities. What do you want to protect? Because that's a real world question right now. And let's ask Darnell. Darnell, what do you most want to protect in state government?
Well, I would most want to protect higher education. Just as education was important then, it's also important now. And more specifically, I would love to protect the HBCU, which I do attend Southern University. I would like to fund more into
the historically
HBCU.
black colleges.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. And I would like to fund more into that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And is tuition a way to help solve that problem?
Yes, sir. Yes, yes.
You think so?
I
Or
think
should there be more state funds given to it?
State funds should be put more into it.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
How about Michael?
I agree with Darnell. Higher education is definitely the key. I attended LSU myself, and I believe that if you lose higher education, the ability for young kids to get a higher education, we're losing our people in the state, and they're going to keep moving out.
Now, your next door neighbor, Cheryl, do you agree with your colleague here?
Well, I believe in supporting higher education. I think it's very, very, very important. However, I think if you don't start even at the pre-K level, putting funds into education at the bottom, we won't even have any need for any higher education. You know, we have to really start at a very young level, educating children, giving them a good, effective education, and through elementary school and on up.
Now, I see a lot of nodding heads here on that. Now, the state does provide a lot of money for local public school systems. Is there anyone else who thinks that should be our priority in our state budget? Mary?
From my standpoint, they have already been cutting funds from elementary and secondary education. They started in Bobby Jenner's budget last year, and it's continuing over to 2012. So we need to be finding ways to add monies to elementary and secondary education, because at this point, and I have a sister and other people that are teachers and principals, they're going in their pockets trying to put money there for books and papers and pencils.
Okay.
Some of their salaries is going toward that.
Yeah, and I think what they're doing is the state level of funding for higher education under the executive budget right now is about the same level as it was last year. The big difference is the tuition hikes. Does anybody have a problem with the idea of tuition? I mean, after all, we do have one of the lowest tuition rates among college systems in the country. Is anybody not like the idea of raising tuition, which is what Governor Jindal and many others want to do? David, how about you?
I think the biggest problem is you're asking for raising tuition at the same time you're decreasing service on the campuses. So you're laying off professors and closing schools of instruction, but you're going to raise tuition. So it's hard for me as a consumer, as a parent who has a child who's going to be college age relatively soon, to understand how am I getting my bang for my dollar? If you were raising tuition and guaranteeing that there wouldn't be those staffing cuts, if I was going to make sure that I was getting the full scope of services as before, or if we were having a real discussion on maximizing our university structure and maybe saying maybe we do need more 2-year junior colleges and fewer 4-year universities, if we were having an honest discussion there.
So a restructuring is what you're talking about in addition to the tuition
just
issues. Now, Ryan was dying to jump in there. How about it?
Well, as a recent college grad, of course, I took out a bunch of student loans to get through college 4 years ago. Now, seeing the amount of budget cuts and the tuition hikes that are going on with the current college-age kids, I don't know how they're going to be able to survive with the amount of loans and debt that they will be having whenever they get out of college and start entering the workforce.
Well, let's talk to a prospective college student, Allison. Allison is our high school student at Corinne Crowe. She's from Opelousas. And tell us about how your future is being affected by the budget situation as you see it now.
Since the cuts start at all levels of education. Currently in my high school, we only offer 2 years of foreign languages. Already that's affecting me, seeing as I want to go to school at Columbia University, and they ask for 4 years of foreign language credits. This summer I'm taking a college course to try and make up for that deficit. I'm also thinking about tuition. If you're raising tuition in Louisiana but not changing the quality of education, a lot of college students are going to be leaving the state because if you're going to be paying out of pocket more money and the TOPS isn't going to cover everything, what's the difference between $10,000 of debt or $25,000? You're going to be paying for a very long time.
Now at Karen Crowe High School, that's where you go, right?
Yes,
and do some of your peers feel the same way?
I have a friend who was thinking about attending LSU, but when she heard about the tuition hike, she said, I might as well just stay at UL. There's no way that I'll be able to go at LSU.
Is there anyone who thinks that health care should be the highest priority? We've had a lot of consensus here on, okay, Mary, just real quick.
Yeah, I think health care should be a major priority. And looking at Erwin Long, that's one of the vendors, they're talking about taking more cuts. And if you cut Erwin Long some more, you take in hospitalization and a means by which poor people and low-income people to be seen. So I think that's a big priority.
Now, one of the ways of addressing the healthcare costs was to sell some prisons. That is the plan of the Jindal Administration. There's some prisons that they want to sell in order to generate some cash. And I know just before the show we were chatting about prison sales, and everybody wanted to get in on it. What do you think of the prison sale issue?
From my perspective, I think that if you did that and privatize it, and saying that this is where he wants to go with it, the state is still spending money at an alarming rate to the company, whomever the privatizer is that he's selling it to. So he's really taking the money out of the left hand, putting it in the right hand.
Interesting. I know, Celeste, you had a number of thoughts about this.
Well, my biggest issue with privatizing prisons is that obviously we're going to pay these people by the head, per capita, how many people you have in prison. And if we're going to pay you by the number of people you have in prison, then you have no motivation to help people get out of prison. And you also have no motivation to keep people from coming back into prison. You know, people make mistakes, people do things, but my hope is that when you go into prison, you come out with the tools that you need to become a productive member of society, not to go right back to crime and right back to that cycle that gets you back in.
Right.
And
the whole budget question of selling the prisons raises these kind of important social issues. I know some others had some thoughts on the prison sale. And Lewis, how about you?
Yes. When you talk about warehousing inmates, basically that's what you'll have when you talk about privatizing the prison. Like Celeste said, when you have inmates and they have no motivation not to return, then what's going to happen? You're going to pay an alarming amount to house these people. They'll get out and they'll return. And you'll continue that cycle. Then you have to consider whether or not they're getting the same type of service or the same level of services that they were getting when it was run by the state. And then you start to talk about the legalities of it. Because when inmates are not afforded the opportunities for education, social services, mental health services, then what happens? Then they file lawsuits. And a lot of times they'll win because.
All right. Let's go to the question of taxes because we just have a few minutes left, and I want to get into that, the tax situation. Dan, you had your hand up. Should we be raising taxes to solve this problem? We haven't really gotten into that very much.
Well, I'm afraid that the reason why we're gotten into these desperate efforts to raise money like by selling prisons, which is one-time money, is because the legislature and the governor, in a way, have backed themselves into a corner if they're saying they're not going to raise taxes. And I really think, that there needs to be a more sensible approach to balancing between, just as our polls showed, that people feel like we should have in a sense, a balance between raising taxes and then cutting spending in certain targeted areas.
Mia, what do you think? Taxes or no taxes?
I believe it should be a combination of both. I'm actually a single mother, not by choice. I'm a widow. So I can't imagine losing my job because of cuts. So I would rather do a combination of both.
James, what do you think of the idea of a tobacco tax to try to raise some revenue and close this budget?
I find the whole thing much more pervasive than how it's being discussed here, frankly. We have, here's Bobby. He's got a monumental task he's saddled with the results of years and years and years of unaccountability on the part of legislators who drop something on you and go home. And and it mounts up and it mounts up, and there's giveaways and there's buying of votes and all of this kind of thing. And finally, somebody has to step in and do it. Taxes? No, I don't like taxes at all. I don't never touched a cigarette in my life, but I don't think I ought to be getting money for somebody else's
That's great.
taxes.
You'll have 3 legislators that you could address that question directly to here in just a moment when they appear on the panel. So we'll get to them in just a few moments. Well, that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further discuss Budget Battle 2011. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're exploring the battle to balance the budget in this year's regular legislative session. Joining us now is our panel of experts. State Senator Gerald Long is a Republican from Winfield. Senator Long's district includes Grant, Natchitoches, Rapides, Red River, Sabine, and Wynn parishes. Long serves on the Senate Finance Committee that oversees the appropriation of state funds. State Representative Patricia Haynes Smith is a Democrat from Baton Rouge who was elected in 2008. Representative Smith is a member of the House Appropriations Committee and serves as the chair of the Louisiana Legislative Black Caucus. Paul Rainwater is the Commissioner of Administration. Prior to his appointment in June of 2010, Mr. Rainwater served as Governor Bobby Jindal's Deputy Chief of Staff. He was Executive Director of the Louisiana Recovery Authority and Legislative Director for U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu. Page Cortez is a Republican state representative whose district includes South Lafayette, Broussard, and Youngsville. Representative Cortez serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is also a member of the Acadiana and Republican delegations. Now, let's go to our participants for their questions. But, first, I think I'd like to just have a general question for all of you. I mean, one of our survey questions, and picking up on the sentiment of some of the folks here, is one of the solutions to this could be a balance of tax increases and cuts. And yet we seem to be headed on a path of just cuts and some patches. I want you all to address that question. Why not a combination of two to make this work? And why don't we start with you, Paul Rainwater, who is the budget chief and has to sort this out.
Thank you. When I took this job last year in June, the governor asked me to look at the problem that we had in spending and look at the expenditure side. The reality of it is that what we have in state government is unsustainable. So we had a choice. You either raise taxes or you look at the expenditure side and you cut and you become more efficient. And so what we chose to do was try to create a sustainable sized government without passing on taxes to the taxpayer. So we worked very hard. We started off with a 35% exercise. We whittled that down, and the governor made it clear that we were going to protect critical programs like in education. We didn't cut the K through 12. We fully funded the minimum foundation program by $3.3 billion. We worked very hard to protect higher education and health care and critical services, and continue to protect our gains that we've had in the economy. So and you can't raise taxes and expect to be competitive in the state and in the world. We've added 39,000 jobs to this economy. We've almost $8.9 billion worth of capital investment. So we chose not to raise taxes and look at the expenditure size to shrink the size of state government and create something that was much more sustainable going into the future.
That's great. It's a good, concise summary. I appreciate it. It's also a nice tie. I have one exactly like that. I almost put it on tonight, and I'm glad I didn't because we would look just alike.
I bought it on sale.
Senator Long, why don't you take a shot at that? We'll go right down the road.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for being here tonight. Your presence here tells us that there's a lot of people interested in state government. I tend to err on the side of simply looking closely at the budget. I think there's some more work that we need to do. I live in a rural part of the state. My people are hard pressed, and I believe that personally tax increases tend to work in a negative fashion in a downturned economy. I think we can look at the budget. We can come up with some answers. I'm not suggesting that we may not need to be creative from the perspective of creating revenue, but we need to be careful that we do not become engaged in increasing taxes simply because we haven't looked elsewhere. Keep in mind that the state budget every year increases at a rate of 3 to 4%. It is just the natural growth of government. Think of your household, if you will, and you realize that every year your expenses continue to go up. We need to continue to manage what we have. Let me remind you parenthetically, we are not broke as a state. We're spending $25 billion, which will be in House Bill 1. We'll have some appropriations in House Bill 2 and other supplemental appropriations through capital outlay projects. And so we're not broke. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you, we're far further along in this recovery than most other states. I think a tax increase would work detrimentally against what we're doing. I think we need to stay the course, be patient, and understand that this too shall pass, maybe another year, but I think we need to be very careful before we start asking our people to pay more before we become responsive with what we have.
Thank you, Senator Long. And Representative Smith, do you have a different view of things?
Definitely do. I respect the message given by the senator as well as by Mr. Rainwater, Commissioner Rainwater. But I do a survey in my district every year, and one of the questions that I asked was, would you support a cigarette tax? Overwhelmingly, the response that I got back from my constituents was that they would support a cigarette tax. I think that when you look at our budget and not bringing in any new revenue into the state is a problem, and it's problematically not only for this year's budget but also for down the road. But the folks always say that we don't listen to them. And I think that it's important to remember that you are the citizens of our state. And when you tell us that this is something that you would support, then I think that we ought to look very closely at what kind of money would be brought in by a cigarette tax and where would it go. It at least would help the health care aspect that we have and cuts against health care that we have in the state. Now, I'm not proposing that we do any additional taxes at this time, but I think that when people tell us what they will support, then we know what we can put out there. But I also would say this, that we consider the fact that we're giving higher ed monies to raise tuition, and yet our students feel like that's a tax on them. So, you know, we will tax students, but will we tax our citizens? And so we've got to balance it all out. I agree cutting state spending is important, but we can't do it strictly on the backs of state government, state workers. And we've been doing that, and that's important to realize that those folks have been very loyal to the state of Louisiana, and they've worked for some years. And when you begin to look at making them be the bulk of where you cut your folk in state government, then we will be looking at those people in lines elsewhere for state services.
And we've heard this point of view, but Governor Bobby Jindal says no new taxes, no renewal of taxes, no suspension of exemptions, the whole range. Representative Cortez, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think one of the things Commissioner Rainwater talked about was the sustainability, and I think we have to take sort of a big picture view, and let's talk about what we do. We took $3 billion, received $3 billion from the federal government over the last few years. Now that money's going away. That's like getting a bonus and expecting to have that bonus year in and year out, and we just don't have it coming back to us. What we do have is almost $500 million more in tax revenue this year than we had last year. So we're moving in the right direction. But the question is, what do we do with those tax dollars? And I've heard it said in this simple format. You know, many of the departments have what they call self-generating revenue. By example, they sell licenses in the Wildlife and Fisheries Department to sustain their budget. But what do we do with the taxes we collect? We educate, we medicate, and we incarcerate. And those three things have to have some type of priority list. And so you brought it all out where you think the priorities are. But, you know, our job through this process is to figure out how can we sustain those three issues. And I think that's what we're going to come to by the end of the session.
Well, it's a good summary by all of you. Let's go to our studio group here. Melissa, what's your view of what these folks have been saying here? I know you had some very interesting questions, and I wanted to let you take a pitch.
Well, thanks, Robert. I think that Representative Cortez really summed it up, because we've got to look at the education piece, the Medicaid piece, and then the prison piece, because it seems like we don't find funds for
early childhood and education, but we always fund money for the prisons. We have more young African American men in prison than we have in college. And so how do we prioritize investment on the front end in education and early childhood investment to sort of alter the course of people's lives?
Okay, you're pitching this question at who in particular?
I guess
I'd
Senator Long,
like,
probably.
Thank you. I'd like to answer that because, quite honestly, if you go back and look at the numbers, we are putting far more money today in early childhood education than we've ever put. It has been a priority of this administration. Now, may I suggest to you there may be a need to put more, but I think we need to be candid enough and honest enough to say that we're on the right road, and these budget restraints that we deal with certainly is going to create limitations. But I would say you're exactly correct. Here's an interesting statistic, and I'll be brief. We drop out of Louisiana schools 16,000 students a year. Interesting enough, according to the statistics that we have in Louisiana, we incarcerate approximately the same number of adults. Education pays. It pays in the prevention of crime. It pays in the prevention of dropouts. We're going to be able to do a whole lot more in education, but I do think we have to candidly look and say, is this the year that we can really begin to put more in? And as we look at the restraints, we have to be honest and say, let's keep going in the right direction, but there are limitations.
I want to be sure that William gets a question in here because I think you had a question that was probably good, best aimed at Mr. Rainwater.
Okay, we have all of these. We can only take money out of education and health and maybe something else, but everything else, there's a constitutional agreement that we can't. Why can't we change the Constitution and pull it from all?
It's an excellent.
And what are the? I'm sorry. And what are the constitutional protecting? What are the services that they're protecting?
So it's interesting, when I took this job and you look at the budget and you say, well, you got a $25 billion budget and you got a $1.6 billion deficit. Well, it should be, of $25 billion, you can cut $1.6 billion out of it. But what you have to do is you start narrowing it down. The reality of it is, of that $25 billion, a lot of it's federal dollars, a lot of it's self-generated revenue, as Representative Cortez mentioned earlier. But what happens is, if you begin to look at it, of the state general fund, about $7.7 billion of it is where you can kind of start to look at what you can cut from. But then about 4.5 of it is protected constitutionally or statutorily. And so you've cut a very small place to cut from. So you end up in higher education and health care. We worked very hard to protect higher education and very hard to protect the critical services that healthcare provides. So what we've done, and last year we had a bill that actually looked at getting rid of some statutory dedications. There are a number of things that are protected through the Constitution. For example, there are professorships and fellowships that are protected. At a time when you're taking $1.6 billion out of the budget, we think that you need the flexibility to go after everything across the board so that you protect those, for example, and I'll just mention it very quickly, we are investing in literacy and numeracy. In fact, we're attacking the problem of education, making sure that those early educators have what they need to take a child and educate them so that you prevent from having to, that child is prepared through K through 12 and goes on to college and stays out of a prison. That's been our goal from day one. So, but again, you've got to have the flexibility to cut out of the budget wherever you need to cut. And so we're going to carry forward some bills this year that will allow us to look at some of those statutory dedications and hopefully be able to get those dollars when you need them.
And Jonathan, you had some questions about privatizing and some concerns about that. I wonder if you could ask the state lawmakers some questions about that.
I'd say, why stop at the prisons? Why not privatize everything that we can? I think history shows that the private sector is always more efficient, more effective than the government.
Representative Cortez, you want to start with that one?
Well, let me say this. That first of all, when you talk about public safety, should that be up to a private entity to carry out public safety? Is that a public responsibility, or is it a private responsibility to keep the citizens safe? That, to me, sort of is in conflict with each other. A private company's job is to make money for their stockholders. So I heard earlier in the conversation, somebody say, well, then you have no motivation to teach and send them back out into the public sector in a safer capacity than they came in. What you have is a motivation to get them back in as quickly as possible, almost as in the hotel business. Heads in beds is sort of the mantra. Well, that is one example where I don't think privatization, and I may disagree with some on the panel, I don't think privatization is the route in that particular venue.
I want to give Representative Smith a chance on this one.
I would agree with Representative Cortez that privatizing the prisons is an issue in that you don't have the same responsibility as a private entity with prisons. But it also, looking at the fact that we have very good, well-trained individuals who are running our prisons right now, and those individuals may or may not have a job if you privatize the prisons. And when they bring in their own people to work the prisons, it's more about how they can cut salaries, how they can cut benefits in order to make the dollar, rather than the safety aspect of the prisons itself. And the other part of this is that when we look at what's being proposed, this is for a 20 to 30-year contract with the individuals who will take over the prisons. In looking at that, over the years, there could be an enormous increase in cost that will come along with the privatization piece. And that's just not someplace that I think we ought to be looking at.
Now, Mike, you have been holding fire. I know you're just waiting to dig into these folks. Why don't you come forward with the question that you had?
I guess I had a comment as well. I just heard two statements that I really wonder about. The first was that a state employee has no motivation to do things inexpensively. When we were talking about privatization, because the private company was trying to make a profit, is what he was dealing with, and the state employee wouldn't necessarily have that same concern. I just think that's absolutely wrong. I think the state employee has every right and every job to try and do it as inexpensively as possible. And if we're going to sit here and say that we oppose privatization simply because we need to save jobs for our Louisianians, then we're absolutely wasting our time talking about a budget. The only way we're ever going to be able to do something with this budget is not to make a decision on we should reduce the cost, because I think everyone in this room is going to say we should reduce the cost. It's how we're going to do it and who is going to make that really work. That's really where this problem is really going to be. And I just don't think that we need to have as many duplicating things in the state of Louisiana in place and trying to fund them to do the same thing. Our education systems are a good point for that. In Baton Rouge, we have 3 colleges. 3, count them. I don't know why. I don't have a clue.
Well, Mike, these are great comments. Pretty soon I'm going to have you come sit up here with the panelists, but those are great. Does anybody want to respond to that real quick?
Sure. I would love to. I would love to talk about the prison cells. And it's interesting when you talk about, what we tried to do in this budget is, again, look at the expenditure side and really try to drive efficiencies. I mean, we've done everything from, I turned the air conditioner off after 5 o'clock, and it saves $4 million. That's $4 million we can spend somewhere else. We've reduced our vehicle fleet by 1,200 vehicles, about $1.6 million. I mean, we have looked at pieces in this budget, and there's no one silver bullet in this budget, but there are many, many, many initiatives. This is, and I've said it at joint budget, but it's a transformational budget, because what we were trying to do is create a smaller state government, one that's efficient and one that does the job. Privatization of prisons, just very quickly, and I'll be brief. The reality of it is, if you look at privatizing a prison, many of those state employees who are good employees will transfer over to the private company. We will save about $326 million over the life of that 20-year contract, because we're not having to repair, the private company takes over responsibility for repairing the equipment, for any capitalization costs that occur. And then we save from the long-term liability of having to take care of that state employee, and you negotiate a very strong contract up front. And the private sector, and the reality is, I've been to a privately run prison in Allen Parish. The Allen prison is run very efficiently, and guess what? They have educational programs. Their goal is not to keep prisoners in jail. Their goal is to meet the contract, and you have people that care about the people they're servicing and providing, because these are folks that are professionals in the industry. So that's the reality of what we're talking about. We're not talking about keeping people incarcerated over a 20-year.
Mr. Rainwater, let me ask you a question, because I mean, some of these prisons are privatized in their operations, but now we're talking about selling them.
But you have
and truly, can you ever really sell the state's responsibility towards those prisoners?
Always responsible for those prisoners. All you're doing is a contract with a private company that does this over. Many of these companies are very large national companies, and they do a very good job. And they have people that have worked in the public sector who just retired from one state system, went to work as the manager of a prison, able to make money. The fact that, the reality of it is those employees, many of them will get better benefit packages. Look, I appreciate what our prison guards do. My own grandfather retired from Louisiana Correctional Institution. So I understand. I was raised in a town where there was a prison. But the reality of it is we cannot continue to sustain this size government, and we've got to reduce the size of it and become more efficient.
Representative Smith.
I was going to say that, and I respect what Commissioner Rainwater says, as well as what the participants said, but there are other issues that we can look at as well. Our DOC budget is well over $500 million. One of the issues that we have is that we incarcerate people for a very long time for very small crimes. And there is no plan in place to really allow individuals to safely and smartly get out of prison. And that's an issue for me when we don't have a plan to look at how we are first in the world in incarceration, but when it comes to letting people out of prison, we're not doing that. And we can save money by looking at a very safe way, a smart way on crime of reducing our prison population, which saves money. Amen. But we're not doing that. And that's something that this state has reluctantly chosen not to do. And I think that it's unfortunate that we continue to say that we want to change the way we go about doing things, but our parole system and our pardon systems are broken. And when they're broken, we keep people in prison for a very, very long time and don't actually put them back into society so that they're capable of being able to function.
So many of these budget issues percolate into these important social issues that we're talking about. Now, Raymond, I know that you had a special question for the panel, so I want you to jump in.
All right, because of health care and Medicaid, is that what a big component of Medicaid is nursing home costs. Yes. The state has instituted a few months ago the Louisiana Partnership Program. That's a partnership between the state and insurance companies to keep people off of, to cause them to buy long-term care insurance, so that way the state does not have to spend that money, which is a huge expenditure in Medicaid, right? Okay, what I would like to know is, since that does affect the budget greatly, is what are you doing to promote the partnership plan?
If we frame this and understand the concept of, once again, maximizing services while reducing cost, I think the Commissioner perfectly described it a moment ago, is that there are no silver bullets. And a lot of what we're doing with this budget, ladies and gentlemen, literally is trial and error, trying to find answers to complicated problems, because you know why? They involve the very best that we have in Louisiana, our citizens. So there are no easy answers, and I do think that is a step in the right direction, but I think that the Commissioner and others have been quite creative in working in regards, because health costs, by the way, is the fastest growing cost that we deal with every year with the budget.
Absolutely.
It is by far.
Absolutely. This is something that you have in place, that it's already there.
Absolutely.
I was curious what is being done to promote that.
I know that Secretary Bruce Greenstein, who just moved his family from Seattle to be here in Louisiana, is working on those sorts of partnerships. Right. He's also working on what's called a coordinated care network, which will, and it's in a very efficient way to provide, medical services and dollars to private providers so they can continue to provide the service. The reality of it is, and we talk about, the use of one-time dollars, for example, but Bruce's department is a perfect example of taking one-time dollars, placing it in the budget, and allowing them to take these coordinated care networks and begin to institute it. It saves us $25 million in the first year, and then in 12 and 13, it saves us about $135 million. So then you begin to create something that's more sustainable and something that you don't have to continue to worry about one-time dollars, but you create an organization that's efficient. And so I think Bruce is, doing just that, reaching out and partnering with, a broad sector of different organizations, private and public, to make that work.
Thank you very much. And Jasmine is both shaking and nodding her head, so I know she can't wait to jump in.
Well, we actually had a question on the survey about the one-time budget proposed selling off of assets. I want to know how realistic is it really to sell off these assets or other one-time budget, one-time things to fill in the gaps of the budget? And if we do take these options, what do we have to look forward to realistically in the long run to fill this hole, make this?
Let's let Representative Cortez take that shot.
Well, there are a number of one-time dollars in the budget, contingent on the budget. You asked a great question, and I sort of alluded to it earlier. We have more tax revenue this year than we had last year. We're going to have more, hopefully, next year than we're going to have this year, and the following year, and so forth. So we're going to grow. Why would you use one-time monies to try to sustain something or create something that you can't sustain going forward? And so that's a great question. And the answer is that Commissioner Rainwater, I don't put words in his mouth, would say that we need to sustain the cliff that we're dropping from to be able to grow back to. And I don't know that the means to that end, as Senator Long has talked about, it's almost a Rubik's Cube, trying to find out when and where you would use one-time money and if you would use one-time money. So I don't know that answers your question, except to say that we have to be very, very careful, in my opinion, when or if we ever use one-time money.
Celeste, I know you had a question you were anxious to ask. Was it the education question? Or?
Yeah, well, right now, people are having trouble paying tuition to go to college. And if we raise tuition, which is one of the options on the table, people are going to have more trouble. And ultimately, some people, raising tuition is going to price people out of going to college. Whenever, according to the 2000 census data, the average high school dropout in Louisiana makes around 21,000, the average high school graduate makes around 25, and the average college graduate makes around 37, how can we afford to not let people be in school? How can we afford to lower the number of people who are graduating college? And we want to do this by not taxing cigarettes. All a cigarette smoker does is drain the medical resources of our state, which y'all said medical is a big deal.
First of all, to all that are listening and hearing these questions, I am opposed to a tax. I think again, my original premise, whether it's on cigarettes, whether it's on medicine, whatever it's on, I think timing is more important than time. I think we need to deal with the deficit, but I'm opposed to any form of taxes, and the reason that I'm opposed to it is that this is what my people in North Louisiana tell me. I don't think that we necessarily need to look at a cigarette tax or an alcohol tax, because quite honestly, if we start doing that, then we need to put scales by restaurants when we walk in, and if we're overweight, then there's a tax imposed there. I think we've gone way over the top in taxes. I think there's a lot of room left for us to manage what we have. Again, we are not broke. We're not broke, and we need to be good stewards of what we have. I just think that the timing on these taxes just simply doesn't fit the economy at this time.
Well, let me add in one other question here, because let's remember this is an election year. Let's assume the redistricting plans take shape for the House and Senate legislative seats, and there is an election this fall. Now, of the three of you state lawmakers, are you running for re-election?
Yes.
You're running for re-election, and you may be running for Senate, right? You going to announce today?
He's running for the Senate.
We'll see. Okay, but you want to run for the legislature again. Okay. How big an impact do you think the election is having on this whole budget discussion? If not just for you personally, then on the legislature.
It's huge, isn't it? You can't get around it. We go back home, and obviously we're all cut from the same cloth, and that is we want to come back. I happen to enjoy this.
Representative Smith?
Yeah.
And as I said, I follow what my folks tell me, and if they're telling me that they support a tax, then, I mean, I'm actually a co-sponsor of the bill, so I don't have a problem with the cigarette tax.
Right. How about you?
Well, South Lafayette Parish is a very conservative area, a very big anti-tax area, so I would oppose a tax regardless. But I will say that your question resonates. Why do people listen, I think is the question. Why do you listen more to your constituency in an election year than you would in any other year? And I hope that's not what you meant, but it sounded like it. And I would say
that's what I meant. Yes, okay, that's fine. Let's put
I
that
would
right
say
out
that you would find that most legislators that I have met in the Capitol listen to their constituency on a regular basis. But it is a tax year, and I think Senator Long is exactly right. You've got the governor has already been on the record saying, I will veto any tax bill that comes across my desk. That's a part of the civic process.
But you all nodded your heads when I asked, is it having an impact?
Sure.
So this was Mary.
Yeah, first of all, I think the one-time tax is a Band-Aid effect. It's not going to solve the problem. I want to ask Ms. Smith about the GO grants back to school. I'm very concerned about that because I think 70% or 75% of the GO grants are African American children, and it's cutting them out and cutting education.
Okay, this is a type of grant that is especially suited to lower income people,
right.
And so
the GO grants are is a part of the budget, but it's a lower part of the budget than TOPS is, and of course we protect TOPS, but we don't protect the GO grants. We simply leave it at a level, and we don't put enough money into it. So, and the reason that is given is because most of those students are on Pell Grants. But unfortunately, we recognize that Pell Grants are also being cut, and that a lot of those students don't get the full amount of Pell Grants. So we're in a catch-22. But I would like to see that TOPS and GO grants are really looked at simultaneously, and not one being looked at in favor of the other.
All right. Now, I know Dan has a very profound question. Our Episcopalian minister, will you please launch that one at them? Let's see if we can get to it.
Okay, I'm hoping I ask you the right one. I
wanted a question on the moral issue.
Yeah, really. I was going to ask, do you consider creating a budget? Is the budget a moral document? And if it is, where do you see us doing good in the current budget, and where are we not doing good? And I wouldn't want to say evil, but where are we not doing the good?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I firmly believe that we are, in fact, our brother's keeper, and that there is a moral obligation that legislators have, and State Louisiana has, to meet the needs of our people. And I think that when we start a budget, we really ought to craft it from that perspective. That is, meeting the needs that are essential to the benefit of our people, and then expanding it as we have dollars and revenues and resources left over.
Let's see if we can get everybody to answer this question, because I think it's a good one.
Well, and it is a good question. I would agree with that, but unfortunately, when we look at the budget and we look at the areas that we have to cut, then the most vulnerable of our citizens often get the brunt of the cuts. And then in that respect, we have to question ourselves, are we doing the moral and right thing?
Commissioner Rainwater, morality in the division of administration. We're ready to hear.
Absolutely. I've been asked this question once before, and we take it very seriously, and the governor takes it very seriously. And we just didn't write the budget in Baton Rouge. I mean, I went out and met with a lot of stakeholders around the state, not just supporters, but other people that had other views. And the reality of it is we worked very hard to protect critical services and to make sure there's a safety net there for people. We protected GO grants. We sure did, because we felt it was important to make sure that people went to college. We're increasing TOPS. We protected K through 12. We worked very closely with the Department of Children and Family Services to make sure that they could continue to provide the same level of services, not necessarily in Baton Rouge, but outside of Baton Rouge, being very creative, working with nonprofits and foundations and faith-based groups, because they can do it much more efficiently than state government can do it. Baton Rouge doesn't have to do everything. People out there, just as yourself, Dan, can do the same type of work and being in a creative way. So, yes, I believe when you look at where we spend our dollars, I think what you'll see is that we protected critical services. We wanted to make sure we continued the gains we've made in this economy so that people can open new businesses, people can have opportunity, and continue to grow this state.
Okay, and Representative Cortez, you've had the most time to think about this question.
Well, and I think it is absolutely a moral document, but I'll give you an example of what we go through. We have now waivers, new opportunity waivers for the developmentally disabled. We have a long waiting list of people who would love to get something for their child so they could have a caretaker so that they could go out and become a productive citizen and give back to the economy, give back to this great state. And they come in front of us in the Appropriations and Finance Committee and say, please fund these waivers. But it's about we have more needs and resources. Every day we have more needs than resources. We have people that come to us and say, please fund education at a higher level. And we say we wish we could, but the public safety of the state depends on us funding public safety and incarcerating those people who could hurt your family. And so every one of those needs is very important, and the list is longer than the resources are available. And so that becomes problematic, but I appreciate that question. It is a moral doctrine.
Thank you very much, but I wish we could follow up. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this question and answer segment, as great as it is. Now, I want to thank our panelists, Senator Long, Representative Smith, Commissioner Rainwater, and Representative Cortez. And when we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Robert, one of our participants suggested we should continue on and maybe add some more information, and I think we hope everyone at home will go online and add their comments to this, because it was a very passionate and lively conversation.
It was a good discussion, and the law says they've got to balance the budget, so here comes the session one way or another. They've got to get it resolved. So.
But you know, it's always hard to decide where you want to cut. That's the question, you know, when you finally get down to it, because people really agree in education and health care and some key things.
I think it's the $1.6 billion question this time around. So.
Well, we were talking about the cliff, but we hope it maybe is a bridge to somewhere as opposed to falling off the cliff that we had.
There are definitely going to be some casualties, whether it's a cliff or a slope. So.
Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, you can take this month's survey, view extended interviews, and sign up to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Post a comment and let us know how you think the state should handle its budget shortfall. We'd love to hear from you, like we did from Adrian when we asked on Facebook, would you support increasing the sales tax on cigarettes to help balance the budget? Well, Adrian wrote, I'd much rather see the reinstatement of the Stelly plan. But yes, I support that. I just took the survey. I'm sure it will be an excellent discussion on Public Square, and indeed it was. Thanks for the feedback, Adrian. It was a great discussion. Remember, you can track the legislature every night on LPB's Capitol Beat at 6:57 and 9:57.
Well, thanks to special tax incentives, Louisiana has become one of the most popular locations in the country for film and television production. But some analysts say the benefits of film tax credits are significantly overstated. Explore who profits from filmmaking on next month's Louisiana Public Square. Lights, Camera, Louisiana. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org. Support for this program is provided by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Through sustainable forestry, LFA members promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forests for generations to come. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.